Early this summer, a guy made an appointment to come see me in my office. It's a guy I've known for some time, but he made an appointment to come see me as pastor. He'd grown up in South Georgia, idyllic kind of childhood, blue-collar home, 2 younger sisters. He said that every night there was the same ritual in his house. His parents would tell him at bedtime, "It's time for bed, so go brush your teeth, come kiss us goodnight, say your prayers." See, he had no idea how informative that litany would become for him the rest of his life. All the rest of his life, when it was time for bed, he would brush his teeth, kiss his family, say his prayers. But what he came to talk to me about was that he was confessing that for the last 2 years or so, he had stopped praying altogether. Not just at bedtime, he had stopped praying. He said that in 2007, 2008, when the economy hit the skids, his carpet-related business was in dire trouble. He kept extending more lines of credit, getting deeper and deeper into the hole, praying and praying and praying that God might release him from that, and he heard no answers. The stress he was feeling at work, he brought home, and so his home life got more and more tense, and then it got louder and louder. Then he made some bad choices, which made things even worse. And finally, she slammed the door one last time. And he said, "For about 2 years, I have not prayed not one time because I can't tell what difference it makes." Now, most of the time in church, when we talk about prayer, we talk about the kind of prayers we cross-stitch on pillows, the sweet prayers of children. But today, I want us to talk about prayer when prayer is difficult. Because my friend who came to see me isn't the only one living through that. Others of you have been there when prayer was most difficult. Over my years of ministry, I have heard so many variations of why people don't pray anymore. Some people, like this guy, just get disillusioned. They tell me, "I prayed for healing and the malignancy won, and I'm done with it. I prayed and prayed and prayed that my son would beat his addiction, and he remains addicted." I know people who have prayed so sincerely, and God did not come through for them like they hoped God would, and so they turned hard and angry toward God. And other people I know have stopped praying because it strikes them as illogical, almost like something they've grown out of. I've heard people say, "God knows the best anyway. Who am I to pray and try to direct the will of God?" I read this week where one woman was told that hundreds of people were praying for her healing from cancer. And she wondered if their prayers mattered. She said, I'm quoting, "Am I more likely to get healed than my friend who also has cancer, but only a handful of people regularly praying for her?" She asks a reasonable question. Does God have a gauge? Is God measuring how many people you have praying for you, how big your prayer team is, and once it reaches a magic unknown number, you get the healing? So some people have just stopped praying altogether. And so far, I'm mentioning the barriers to prayer for things people want to pray for. We haven't talked about the things we are instructed to pray for and don't even want ourselves. There are people who are still praying who won't pray some prayers. When we're all together in corporate worship, we will pray, "And Lord, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us." But when we're at home and it's private, that's a hard prayer. how many people really pray that God will be gracious to the people who have done us wrong? And I have an idea that the first letter to Timothy struck this chord. The writing that is ascribed to Paul to Timothy says, first of all then, I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for everyone, for kings and all who are in high positions. And I'm thinking Timothy doesn't exactly want to be offering up prayers and intercessions and thanksgivings for everyone, and especially the kings and the governing officials. I mean, since the Christian church was being persecuted, forcing faith communities to meet in hiding, sometimes punishing them even to death, this is a rather peculiar request that Timothy should pray for people who govern over him. And some people date this letter, as being in the 60s, not the 1960s, the 60s, when Nero would have been in power. Now, some of you remember what a rotten guy Nero was. He's reported to have had his mother stabbed to death, his wife beheaded. This is not a nice guy. In AD 64, there was a great fire in Rome. Such a big fire that historians call it the Great Fire of Rome. And many believe that Nero set the fire to clear the land for the palace he wanted to build. And to make it worse, Nero was so anti-Christian that he publicly blamed the Christians for the fire and had many of them punished for the fire by burning them. This guy was a mess. And his conflicted life and political turmoil took its toll. And in the end, Nero finally took his own life. And his final words before taking his own life, he said, "What a showman the world is losing in me." This guy was self-serving, arrogant, violent toward the Christian community. And the letter to Timothy says, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for everyone, for kings and those in high positions. Well, that's just kind of hard to figure, isn't it? Sometimes prayer is hard, and that's what I want us to take an honest look at today. Sometimes we don't feel like our prayers matter. Sometimes we feel like we lift our prayers to heaven and they seem to fall back to earth like a wounded bird and never make it to their desired location. It's hard to pray when we're called on to pray for things we don't even want anyway, like the prayer that Timothy was instructed to offer. And perhaps the hardest prayers are the prayers that God will bless others and change me. Because if we're honest, most of our prayers are that God will bless me and change others and the circumstances around me. On the TV game show Jeopardy, you know that if you don't answer in the form of a question, it's wrong, right? The way you answer it matters. Well, I have sometimes wondered if my prayer life consists of my wish list just offered in the form of a prayer. Then you can call yourself praying. I mean, you would call me selfish if I just stomped up and down and said, I want to get that promotion and not her. I want my game not to get rained out. I want my child to win the trophy. I want one of those covered parking lots behind Neiman's at Lenox. But if we offer it in the form of a prayer, dear God, grant that my leg will heal in time for the game. God, grant that the rain will end before the church picnic begins. I do this. We all do this. And I find comfort in a relationship with God that's intimate enough and honest enough that we can offer all of our earthly concerns into the care of a perfect parent who loves us. And even Jesus offers these prayers and sometimes does not get the answer he prayed for. Right? You remember, Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus prays, "Take this cup from me." We know the cup was not removed. In Jesus' longest recorded prayer, he prays that all of them may be one. Father, just as you are in me and I am in you. This is a prayer for unity for the Christian community. And as we know, there are about 34,000 distinct denominations and sects. It's not that we should not offer our hopes into the caring heart of the Holy One. But I'm worried about the maturity of a prayer life that only consists of the I want kind of prayers. And worse, if we keep score on the I want prayers to see how God is doing. So much of the disillusionment with prayer is that we measure the effectiveness of prayer by how many times God answers yes to our demands. And it is not measured on how many times we answer yes to God's. Here's a tough gut check question. I asked the question of myself this week. I didn't like the answers, but I'm going to put the question to you. If you did an inventory of your prayer life, if you went back over the transcripts of the last 3 weeks of prayer, how many of your prayers would be prayers of God's blessing to you and yours, or prayers that God would intervene on the lives, change the lives of other people? Today we're talking about hard prayer. And the hard and mature prayer is that God will change us and bless others. And the really mature prayer asks God's blessing on everybody. Everybody. Did you catch that in the reading? Listen for it this time. Intercessions and thanksgivings be made for everyone. This is right and acceptable in the sight of God our Savior, who desires everyone to be saved. There is one mediator, Christ Jesus, who gave himself a ransom for all. Bless others, change me. There is a hard and sacred distance between praying, "My will be done," and praying, "Thy will be done." I don't fully understand the great mystery of prayer, but there is something transcendent at work. God does play in the space that's opened up by the life of prayer. Does God change things, or does God change people who change things? Well, there is something miraculous that happens. For those who continue in prayer and grow in prayer and even pray the hard prayers, something happens. For every person I have ever met who told me about the disillusionment with prayer and the ways they have given it up, there have been 10 people I have known who have come up and told me the story of where prayer made a difference, where something changed in their life. As Carrie Newcomer sings, miracles do happen every shining now and then. So don't give up on the power of what we do not know. Jesus never gave up on the life of prayer. He went to the house of prayer 3 times a day, as was his custom, and we know that he prayed in between those times because we have so many recorded prayers in between. We know he taught the disciples how to pray. Jesus never gives up praying. And with some urgency, Paul appeals to Timothy to pray, and not just the easy prayers. Pray big. Pray big. One commentator says that Paul approaches the topic more like a plumber than a poet. He's looking to get the job done, making practical connections so that Timothy's ministry will not get clogged by less essential things. So pray big and random, whether you feel like it makes a difference or not, whether you feel like it or not, whether you feel heard or not. Keep praying, and pray this way, says Paul. Pray for others. Pray blessings for other people. Pray for people you find hard to love. Supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for everyone. Everyone. Pray big. Maybe God is changing things because of your prayers. Maybe God is changing you. But something mystical and miraculous happens when we give ourselves to praying the hard prayers. As John Chrysostom famously said in the 4th century, no one can feel hatred toward those for whom he prays. So just keep praying. The easy prayers, the hard prayers, the I don't want to prayers. With some urgency, keep praying for others and those you don't want to pray for. And don't worry if your prayers are formed right, if they're theologically appropriate. Just keep communing with the Holy God and trusting that in that private space of communion, there is some mystery we do not understand. But do it with urgency, whether you feel like it or not. A good friend of mine is a minister of education here in this state, and he's a really good one. Been at the same church a lot of years. His pastor asked him, pastor was concerned about outreach in the church, and he asked him to write up something about an outreach strategy. And so my friend, in his very thoughtful way, he told me this story. He said, in his way, he wrote like a research paper. He talked about the theological underpinnings of outreach, the historical Baptist approaches of outreach. He did all this complicated stuff, bound it, put it in the pastor's box to read. He said 2 days later, it came back into his box with a Post-it note on it. And the Post-it note from the pastor said, new outreach strategy, identify prospects for the church, 2, visit them. My friend had made so complicated what the pastor was trying to make urgent and simple. The commentator says, Paul approaches the topic more like a plumber than a poet. He's looking to get the job done. He's telling us to just keep praying, even when it's hard. Get the job done. Go ahead and pray on sunny Saturdays. Go ahead and pray that your grandchild makes cheerleading. But pray the hard stuff too. Pray for people you don't like. Pray for your church. Pray for your pastor. Then pray for your pastor again. Pray for everybody. Pray for the guy at work who drives you crazy. Pray for the family member you haven't spoken to in a long time and said you'd never forgive. Keep praying. Because some mystery happens in ways I do not understand. Something happens in the sacred silence that changes us and changes the world. If you hear God speaking to you in the sacred silence right now, urging you towards some new commitment of faith, I look forward to celebrating that with you up front and celebrating it with the rest of the church as we stand and sing and decide together.